Thank you, Crystal, for the kind introduction and for the invitation to Berlin. It's great to be here. So, as many of you know, there's a kind of omnipresent narrative in Europe about the failure of multiculturalism and the retreat from multiculturalism. And so multiculturalism is widely seen as having failed in the sense of being bad for society as a whole, as well as being bad for immigrant communities themselves, and that in recognition of this fact, it's widely believed that most governments and most political parties on both the right and the left have retreated from multiculturalism, and that we're now therefore living in a post-multicultural era. So I want to offer a slightly different narrative about where we are. I don't believe that multiculturalism has failed. I don't think we have evidence for that. And perhaps more surprisingly, I also don't think we've really had a retreat from multiculturalism, at least in some respects that I'll try to explain. And so I think we are still living in a multicultural era and will continue to do so, and that it's important to be clear about that to fully understand what our options are. So I want to talk about retreat and failure, but before I get there, I need to step back and ask what exactly multiculturalism is that may have failed and been retreated from. And according to the kind of master narrative that dominates the public debate, multiculturalism is primarily about the perpetuation of cultural practices by immigrant groups. So in Britain, they call this the 3S model of multiculturalism for saris, samosas, and steel bands. So these are, dress, food, music. These are considered as kind of discrete cultural practices of immigrant groups, and the goal of multiculturalism is to encourage immigrant groups to perpetuate these cultural practices by giving them recognition and support. And on some versions, it's thought that the best way to enable or to ensure that immigrant groups perpetuate cultural practices is for them to live separately on their own, apart from the rest of society, and so you get the image that multiculturalism is about creating parallel societies. Okay, so that's the kind of standard view about what multiculturalism is. And if that's what multiculturalism is about, then I too would say that it's a bad idea. It has a number of obvious flaws that you're probably all familiar with. If multiculturalism was kind of exclusively or primarily about perpetuating discrete cultural practices, then obviously it has nothing to say about what is, for most immigrants, their main concern. I mean, immigrants come to a country to make a better life for themselves, so they care about jobs, they care about housing, they care about the education of their children, and if multiculturalism is about saris, samosas, and steel bands, it seems to have nothing to offer for the real needs of immigrants. It also has a danger. If multiculturalism is about perpetuating discrete cultural practices, surely some of those practices are actually not worth perpetuating. They may be illiberal. They may violate human rights. So think about coerced marriages, arranged marriages, for example. And we don't, as a society, don't want to say that groups have a right to perpetuate practices that violate human rights. And there's also this image of multiculturalism about perpetuating discrete practices by creating parallel societies obviously raises the risk that ethnic relations will be polarized, that people will exaggerate the differences between groups. It seems to rule out the possibility of productive interaction, exchange, hybridity, and so on, and instead is likely to lead to stereotyping and prejudice. Okay, so if that's what multiculturalism was about, then it's plausible to think that it would have a number of perverse effects. But the real puzzle is, why would anyone think that a country would adopt such a picture for the integration of its immigrants? I mean, it seems, under what circumstances would a government want to adopt that model for its immigrants? And to my mind, the only circumstances where that's even a remotely plausible picture for public policy is in relation to temporary migrant workers. That if you're expecting temporary workers to return to their country of origin, then you might well think that the appropriate policies are one that keep them relatively separate in the hope and expectation that they will return to their country of origin. And I think we actually do have some examples in some European countries of forms of multiculturalism that are returnist, that were intended to encourage and to make more likely immigrants to return to their country of origin. But in most countries, and I think in every country today, it's recognized that immigrants are not going to return to their country of origin. They're here to stay. And so we need a conception of multiculturalism that is about their membership in society and their participation in society. And I think that the form of multiculturalism that has been adopted in this context in relation to permanent immigrants and prospective citizens is a completely different picture of multiculturalism. So let me tell you a different story about the goals of multiculturalism and its associated policies. I think the right way to think of multiculturalism, again, apart from the context of returning guest workers, that in other contexts, multiculturalism is best understood as part of a larger human rights revolution. So one way to think of it is that ethnic and racial relations across all of the Western democracies up until the Second World War were based on ideologies of racial hierarchy. Some races and ethnic groups and religions were seen as superior, advanced, others were seen as backward or primitive, but the Second World War and the Human Rights Revolution discredited all of those older ideologies of racial hierarchy. And so all of us, all Western societies, have been faced with the challenge of restructuring ethnic relations in ways that are more consistent with fundamental norms of equality. And this has taken different forms in different countries depending on the history of ethnic relations. So in the United States, the relationship between former masters and former slaves has been a fundamental dynamic. In my country, we've also had the issues about relations with the indigenous peoples. And in other countries, it's primarily in relation to immigrant groups. But in all of these contexts, what we have is the challenge of replacing older relationships, which were primarily based on, as I say, on hierarchy, on force and coercion, and on paternalism, and replacing them with relationships that are based more on values of cooperation and participation and trust and consent. And so, in other words, they're all about creating newer forms of democratic citizenship. So in my view, multiculturalism, in most contexts, is about building new forms of democratic citizenship in place of these older ideologies of hierarchy. And in that respect, we can think of parallels also with the struggle for women's rights, the struggle for gay rights, the disability movement. All of these are often described in literature as citizenship struggles, because they're all struggles to replace older models based on coercion and paternalism with new relationships based on cooperation and consent and dialogue and participation and trust. Okay, so that in my view is the fundamental driving aspiration behind multiculturalism. It's one of many citizenship struggles that emerged in the 60s and 70s across the Western democracies as a natural extension of the human rights movement. It uses the same arguments, the same strategies as other citizenship movements like gay rights and women's rights and so on. Okay, so what does this mean concretely? Well, as Crystal mentioned, Keith Banting and I have developed an index of multiculturalism policies, and if you have the book in front of you and you turn to page 41, there's a list of the 8 concrete public policies which we take as a manifestation of this commitment to multicultural citizenship. And you can look at it at your leisure, but it includes some kind of symbolic affirmation of multiculturalism, multicultural education in the schools, ethnic sensitivity mandates for the media, exemptions from dress codes or other forms of religious accommodations, dual citizenship, mechanisms of ethnic group self-organization, representation and consultation, and so on. Okay, so those we take to be the kind of paradigmatic examples of concrete public policies that are intended to help achieve these, to help us build new relations of democratic citizenship in place of these older ethnic hierarchies. And if we think of multiculturalism this way, it's important to note that it doesn't have the flaws that people ascribe to the 3S model of multiculturalism. So these policies, as listed on page 41, they're not just about cultural recognition, they're also about politics, political representation and consultation. They're also about the economy, about education, and about affirmative action. And it's also important to emphasize that they operate clearly within a human rights framework. That multiculturalism on my model is not about the static perpetuation of cultural traditions, whatever they happen to be. It's about creating new relationships of citizenship in place of older hierarchies. And therefore, multiculturalism is embedded in larger human rights struggles. And it invokes human rights language, and it operates within human rights constraints. And so in all cases of Western countries that have adopted multiculturalism, they have not given, no Western country has said that coerced marriages are permissible because we are a multicultural country. In all Western countries, it's always been the case that multiculturalism operates within larger constitutional constraints of human rights. And it's also important to emphasize that on this model of multiculturalism, it's not about separation and segregation of groups. It's about creating new relationships. And these relationships are transformative of both the majority and the minority. The majority has to give up its fantasies of superiority, of defining civilization, of owning the state. It needs to acknowledge that there are other groups who have a voice and a right to participate and to change the terms of citizenship. But it's also transformative of minority identities. They are required to enter into these relations of citizenship, and that's going to transform them in various ways. Okay, so that's my account of the goals of multiculturalism, again, apart from the case of returning guest workers. That's a very optimistic, if you like, account of the goals of multiculturalism, and we might ask, is there any evidence it's working? Right? So lots of public policies have wonderful goals, but often public policies don't achieve their goals. They often have perverse effects, unintended effects, and it might well be that even if I'm right about the goals of multiculturalism, it has nonetheless unintentionally had all sorts of pernicious effects on ethnic relations. Okay, so what do we know about the empirical evidence for the effects of multiculturalism? Well, the reality is we actually don't have much empirical evidence one way or the other. There's not nearly as much social science work on the effects of multiculturalism policies as one might think. But we do have actually quite a bit of evidence about it in the Canadian case. And I don't want to talk too long about the Canadian case, but it is one area where there's been a lot of social science work done. And as I read the evidence, it clearly suggests that multiculturalism has been beneficial about enabling the creation of these new relations of democratic citizenship in two different ways. It's first of all helped to create better relations between citizens and the state. Citizens of different ethnic origins are more likely to have trust in public institutions. They're more likely to participate. For example, they're more likely to vote. They're more likely to run for office than members of ethnic minorities in other countries. So it's helped us to these concrete multiculturalism policies have helped to create and nurture relationships between ethnic minorities and the state. But it's also helped at a more horizontal level to build norms of solidarity amongst citizens themselves in civil society. That it's created a way in which members, the native-born citizens in Canada, can see that when immigrants maintain an ethnic identity, that doesn't make them un-Canadian, doesn't make them disloyal, that multiculturalism says that immigrants can maintain pride in their identity and also be proud Canadians. That's, if you like, one of the fundamental goals of multiculturalism is to affirm the possibility of these kinds of multiple loyalties. And that has helped native-born Canadians to see immigrants as contributors to a shared national project rather than as a threat to it. Okay, now the Canadian story may be a bit of an exception, and one of the articles in the book you have is entitled Canadian Exceptionalism. So I don't want to generalize from the Canadian case, but if we look at other studies that try to look across the Western democracies, insofar as we have these kinds of cross-national studies, they support the claim that those countries that have gone farther down the road of multiculturalism in terms of adopting these policies are more likely to have trust across ethnic lines. They're more likely to have participation by ethnic minorities, and they're less likely to have prejudice and stereotypes. So I think we have at least preliminary evidence that multiculturalism, it's far from failing, has been, generally speaking, beneficial. If that's right, that raises a question, why has there been a retreat from multiculturalism? I mean, if I'm right about what the noble goals are of multiculturalism, creating new relations of democratic citizenship in place of older hierarchies, and if the evidence suggests it's working, why has there been a retreat from it? Well, part of my answer is there hasn't been a retreat from multiculturalism. So if you look at page 71 of the book, as part of this multiculturalism policy index, we have scored the track record of 21 OECD countries at 3 different points in time, 1980, 2000, and 2010. And we just asked, at each point in time, how many of these policies had they adopted? And if you look down that list, if you look at the bottom, you will see there has been a steady increase from 1980 to 2000 and from 2000 to 2010. There continues to be an increase in the average level of multiculturalism policies within Europe and across the OECD generally. There is, of course, some striking exceptions, the Netherlands being an important one, and our table notes that. Netherlands really has retreated from multiculturalism. It has rejected some of the policies it earlier adopted. But most countries in Europe have maintained whatever policies they adopted before, and in fact, most have actually expanded their multiculturalism policies, in some cases quite dramatically. So if you look at a country like Finland, it had 0 in 1980, it's moved up to 6 out of 8 in 2010. Or you could look at Sweden from 3 to 5 to 7, and so on. Okay, so if you look at the actual evidence of what public policies are in place, if you set aside the Dutch case, which really is an exception, there has not been a generalized retreat from concrete multiculturalism policies. What we've seen instead is a massive retreat from the term multiculturalism. The word multiculturalism has become an absolute taboo in many countries in Europe. So even politicians who, politicians who continue to defend certain policies will no longer describe them as multiculturalism policies. They will instead describe them as community cohesion policies or interculturalism policies, or the number of different terms they use. But they have not, in fact, rejected the policies. And my explanation for that is because they're working. Okay, but it's not just a change in rhetoric. There has been a change in policies, and I just want to conclude by explaining how I see what changes have taken place in public policy. As I've just said, the change has not been a dramatic retreat from multiculturalism policies. Those have persisted and in most countries expanded. But at the same time, alongside the multiculturalism policies, we've seen a dramatic increase in so-called civic integration policies. These are policies that at various points in the immigration process test immigrants for how well they're integrating. And so language tests, which now in some countries are imposed before they even enter a country, or they need to pass language tests to renew their residency or to become a citizen. So there's a whole series of courses and tests around integration. Now, it's the adoption of these policies that most people view as evidence for the retreat from multiculturalism. But I just want to emphasize that, as that table shows, they have not, in fact, displaced multiculturalism policies. They've been layered on top of multiculturalism policies. So we have a combination of civic integration policies and multiculturalism policies. That's what we see across many Western democracies. And that, in my view, that should not be a surprise, because if we look at those countries that were the kind of harbingers of multiculturalism, like Canada and Australia, we always had these kinds of integration policies. Canada has always had a language test for citizenship. It's always invested huge amounts of money in language training for its immigrants. It's always insisted on respect for human rights and liberal democratic values and swearing allegiance to the Constitution and so on. So there's no reason, from a Canadian point of view, it doesn't make any sense to think that adopting integration policies contradicts multiculturalism. They've always been part of the same idea in our mind. So, in other words, there is an idea of multicultural integration. And this is what we have aspired to in Canada and in Australia. And I think this is the model to which countries like Finland and Sweden are also, and Britain are also moving towards and aspiring to. It's one which combines policies that assist integration with policies that affirm diversity and accommodate it in the goal of creating these new relations of democratic citizenship. And there's a lot we could say about exactly how these multiculturalism policies interact with civic integration policies. And in the paper, I talk about that at length, but I've run out of time. All I want to emphasize for now is that we shouldn't make this model of multicultural integration, of multicultural citizenship, invisible by our master narrative about the rise and fall of multiculturalism. Thank you.